All right, I got a lot to cover, so I'm going to get straight to it. I'll talk a little bit about myself first, just so maybe give you guys an idea why I might be qualified to give this talk. I started using FreeSWITCH in about 2008 for apartment lines, the small answering service that I work for. And I loved it right away, but I also recognized that the dial plan XML could do a lot, but it couldn't do certain things, only beyond a certain degree of complexity. It really couldn't do things. And so I knew I needed to choose some kind of scripting solution, and the recommended one was Lua, so I picked that. And basically, you know, to kind of boil it down, I've been using Lua in places where I need to have more advanced logic or access to other services that you can't get to from the dial plan XML. That's kind of the gist of it. But I've been doing that for 12 or 13 years now. Probably the most ambitious thing I ever did was wrote an entire replica of Astra's comedian mail voicemail system. I did that whole thing in Lua, and it goes like every single feature. I replicated it. So hopefully that gives me enough creds to be able to share with you guys something about integrating FreeSWITCH and Lua. Now, as far as the talk itself goes, I'm making a couple of assumptions. I'm assuming you're familiar with basic programming concepts and somewhat familiar with FreeSWITCH, but you may not be as familiar with Lua as a language or with integrating FreeSWITCH and Lua. Now, FreeSWITCH and Lua together is very powerful. It can do tons and tons. I can't cover it all in a 25-minute talk. So I've tried to kind of scope my goals to the three that are listed there on the slide. I'm going to try to introduce you guys to Lua as a language. I'll talk a little bit about integrating FreeSWITCH with Lua. I'll have some examples to show off some of what it can do, certainly not everything. And then along the way, I'll just try to point to some other resources in case you're wanting to dig in a little more for yourself to go as deep as you can with it, with the feature set. So here's the battle plan for the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Lua is as a language. And then it'll be just a very brief sort of a visual language primer to kind of get you guys used to looking at Lua. Then I'll talk a little bit about how you integrate FreeSWITCH and Lua. After that, I'll get into some examples. We'll start out with some simple ones and then get more advanced. And if there's enough time at the end, I'll share, since I've been doing this for 13 years-ish, I'll share some of the tips and tricks I've learned that might make things a little bit easier for you guys if you're just getting started. So what is Lua? Lua is a scripting language. And it's a language that you may not have even heard of or worked with. However, if you are in the gaming community or working with embedded systems and doing any programming, I can almost guarantee that you would have heard of Lua or worked with it. And there's a really good reason for that. Lua is extremely small. So if you look at the bottom there, the first two lines represent the size of the entire Lua interpreter, and the second line is the Lua shared library. That's on a Debian Buster installation. It weighs in at just a little over 200K. Now, the bottom line is FreeSWITCH's mod Lua, which wraps the entire Lua library and includes a bunch of extra goodies, and it weighs in at just under a megabyte. So it's very svelte. The FreeSWITCH wiki puts it pretty succinctly. If you're looking for a language to embed in something else, it's going to be hard to do any better than Lua. Lua is also really fast. It's frequently cited as one of the fastest scripting languages around. My favorite thing about Lua, though, is how simple and elegant it is. And one good example of that is there's only one complex data structure in the entire language. It's called a table. But the way they've designed it, you can represent data in a number of different ways. And even more cool, I think, they provide a meta mechanism that allows you to make one table a metadata table for another table. That opens up all kinds of cool programming stuff, including the ability to work with Lua in an object-oriented syntax. So let's get into what Lua looks like as a language. Again, I'm really just in this first section trying to give you guys a visual, just to have a look at it. You don't have to don't try to take everything in. I'll make a few comments as we look through the file. And then hopefully that sort of short visual primer will help you guys with the examples so it looks a little more familiar. If you are interested in getting into the deep weeds with the syntax, the Lua manual online is excellent. And I've got it linked there in that slide. OK, so I'll just have a look at what this looks like visually. I'll make a few comments. So comments start with 2 dashes. Variables can contain letters, numbers, and underscores. Something I should point out is there's line numbers on all my examples, so I'll be referring to those just so you can visually target where I'm talking about So on lines 13 through 17, that's what tables look like. There's a couple different ways to declare them. There's a couple different ways to access the data. You notice they are nested in angle brackets. On lines 21 through 23, that's just a look at what you can do with strings, concatenation, formatting. And then the next section down is conditionals. I find Lua feels kind of familiar to Python to me, just in terms of like the syntax and visually what it looks like when I read it. So that's some conditional statements there. A little down a little further on line 36 through 38, that's a looping construct. Of note, on line 36, that pairs function is an iterator for a table. It's one of the ways that you can iterate through to get the data from a table. And then finally, the bottom section is what a function looks like in Lua. And of note in that particular example is that Lua does have the concept of local variables. So we'll get into the examples in just a minute, but first I want to talk a little bit about how you actually perform the integration. Hopefully, hopefully this will help you get over any stumbling blocks that you might run into when you're trying to make Lua work with FreeSWITCH. It's actually not that complicated at all. So the first thing you need is three things. First thing is you have to have mod Lua, which comes with FreeSWITCH. You have to have that compiled and loaded in FreeSWITCH. I would assume most installations, probably almost all the packaged installations, have mod Lua compiled and loaded by default. But if for some reason your installation doesn't, you would compile it and load it like any other FreeSWITCH module. Next, you may want to look at the configuration. Again, it's totally possible that the default configuration will work for you right out of the box. One area where you can get tripped up there is that if you're going to use third-party Lua libraries to get some of the work done for you, and I recommend that you do for some of the more complex stuff, and I'll show you a couple popular ones in some of the examples, FreeSWITCH needs to be able to find those libraries. So you have to make sure the paths make sense. And the two configuration parameters you look at in the config file are module directory and script directory. You just basically play with the paths there and get until you've got it so that FreeSWITCH can find your libraries, and then you can leverage them quite easily. And then the third thing you need is you got to know where to put your scripts that you're writing so that FreeSWITCH can find them. Now, by default, FreeSWITCH puts FreeSWITCH looks for your scripts in the scripts directory of the FreeSWITCH install. You can configure that, but that's where you would go by default. Okay, so now you've called a Lua script in FreeSWITCH. How do you do something FreeSWITChy with it? Well, FreeSWITCH injects a couple of objects into the script namespace when it's called to allow you to do various things with FreeSWITCH. So there's two main ones that are mostly used. The FreeSWITCH object is a global object, which means anytime a Lua script is called from the FreeSWITCH context, it's going to contain that FreeSWITCH object, and that has many methods hung off of it that you can use to do various things. It's always available even if there's no active session. Now, if you're in a session, like say there's a leg of a call that you're in your dial plan and you call a Lua script as part of that, you will additionally get a session object. And that session object also has a bunch of methods hanging off it, tons actually, which you can use to do things related to the session itself. As an example, you can collect DTMF digits. You can stream a file in for the user to hear, things like that. And there are other objects, but they're not, in my experience, they're not as frequently used. But I did provide a link on the slide there where you can check out the API reference to see some of the other ones. So let's get into the examples. And remember, again, this is just a taste. I couldn't cover it all. Just trying to give you an idea for some of some of what it can do, some of the specific FreeSWITCH specific integration, plus also just some of what Lua does in its operation and syntax. If you want to see a lot of examples and find out fully what FreeSWITCH and Lua can do together, check out the FreeSWITCH Lua wiki pages. I've got them linked there in the slide. They're pretty exhaustive, and there's actually a lot of good example code there too. So our first example is going to be the obligatory hello world. Now, if you look on line 6, you'll see the FreeSWITCH object, and FreeSWITCH object has an mSleep method, which allows you to sleep for a specified number of milliseconds in the script. Below that is a declaration of a table, and remember, as I said earlier, you can represent data in a couple of different ways in a table. This is an array-style representation of a table, and it's just comma-separated values. Now, this is an indexed. The table is indexed, which means it will preserve its order when you loop over it if you do it correctly. So if you look down lines 19 through 21, there is a for loop, which we saw earlier in the visual primer. And in particular, there is an iPairs iterator. Now, the iPairs iterator is the one you use if you want to iterate a table and preserve the order. So if you look above to that table, that is just a list of the various log levels in FreeSWITCH in order from like, most verbose to most critical. So what I'm doing is I'm just looping through that table in order. And then on line 20, I'm calling the console log method on the FreeSWITCH object. And that allows you to log to the console. And I'm passing it the level to log at and the hello world string. So first example. Now, we've seen it. How do we actually run the thing? Because that's something we haven't talked about yet. Let me go back over here and share this last little bit with you. How do you execute scripts in FreeSWITCH? How do you execute Lua scripts in FreeSWITCH? Well, there's a couple different methods that mod Lua makes available. There's Lua and LuaRun. And the essence of the difference is that Lua is blocking and runs in the current thread, and LuaRun is asynchronous and runs in its own thread. So you would use whichever one you needed depending upon the circumstance. And I'll show you quick with this first example what the two look like differently. And there's also two main contexts you can run those commands in. You can run them straight from the console, which I'll do in a second here, or you can run them from the dial plan with that particular kind of syntax. And just because I think it might make more sense of running it in the dial plan by looking at a dial plan example, I'm going to show you this real quick. These are the examples I'm going to run, just done as different extensions in the dial plan. And you can see here, this first one is just a regular old extension with a condition. And then I've got the Lua, the application is Lua, and the data is the name of the script you're going to call. And you can pass arguments to your Lua script. I'll show you in an example how you can collect those arguments. But you just space separate them right there in the data argument. And you can pass arguments as you want. OK, skipped ahead. Get back to running our first example. Let's see this thing in action. I'm going to run it from the command line. And I'm going to show you the difference between Lua and LuaRun. So if you do the Lua one, which is the blocking one, you'll see it's waiting that 3 seconds before it's going to iterate and print hello world, right? But if you do, let me clear the screen to clean things up a little bit. If I use LuaRun, it's going to run it in a separate thread. And so I get a command prompt right away. And then after 3 seconds, it's going to go ahead and print to the console. So that's the basic difference between Lua and LuaRun. With LuaRun, you're not going to get things like sessions. You're basically disconnected, but you can also do things asynchronously to get back to doing what you were doing in your dial plan. So it just depends what you're trying to do as far as which one you would use. All right, next example is making an API call. And one thing you'll notice about this example is it's marvelously short. And it's because I think it's because FreeSWITCH Lua integration has been around for a while, and all the common things you want to do are wrapped up into a nice, neat little method. So on line 5, you can see I'm calling the API method on the FreeSWITCH object. That gives me back an object, which has its own set of methods on it that allow you to do to work with the FreeSWITCH API. The execute method, which I'm calling on line 6, allows you to send it a string, which is executed as an API command, and it will return the string response. In this example, on the next line, I'm just using the FreeSWITCH console log again to print it back to the console. So here I'm just running a status, and then I collect it in that status variable, and I'm going to print it back out to the console. Now, for the rest of these examples, I'm going to run them from my dial plan just because it'll save me some keystrokes. So I'm going to show you what that looks like right there. So you can see the output here. The Lua script was called here from the dial plan. And then here is the output of the print to console after it collected the status. So pretty straightforward. You basically can run any API command you want that way and collect the response. Very handy. How about working with sessions, in particular key presses? In this particular example, I'm going to start from the bottom. It's just a little easier to describe starting from the bottom. And it's going to show off a couple of things specific to sessions. So on line 28, you're going to see that the session has a method called ready. And that ready method is very important to use, especially when you're looping. What ready does is it checks to make sure the session is still active. Now, there are methods on the session object that you can call that won't work if the session isn't active. So it's important to check if it's still active before you do anything. In particular, when you're looping, like if you're going to say you're going to stream a file over and over again to a user, every time around that loop, you're going to want to check, is the session still up and running before I go trying to play that file again. On line 30, you see I'm using the session set input callback, and that allows you to set a callback function in this script. So the function that's in this script will be called, and it happens when there's some kind of user input. So we're going to be collecting DTMF in this example, so that's what I'll be looking for. And I'll get back up and describe that function more in a minute. And then on line 32, there is a session stream file, and that allows you to play a file into the session so the user can hear it. In this particular example, I'm just streaming silence to hold the call open so we can play with the key presses a little bit. Now back up to the callback at the top here. You can see my on-input callback receives some arguments. And the most important ones are the second and third argument. So the second argument tells you what type of input it was. And the third argument is just the data that's coming back from that particular input callback. So and my logic here is quite simple. I'm just checking to see if it's DTMF. And then I'm checking to see if it's a special digit, in this case 9. If it is, I'm taking one action. And then the other branch of my if statement takes another action. Now, one thing that's cool about these input callbacks is you can return special strings. So if you look at line 16, I'm returning break. And the way that works is if there's a file playing in the session and you return a specific string, you can take action on that file. So in this case, break actually stops the file from playing. There's a bunch of them. There's probably like 10 different special strings you can send. You can fast forward and rewind, go to the beginning and end of file, things like that. I've got in the comment there, I think I have the link to the place where you can go look at all of them if you're interested. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the content of this example. So let's run this sucker and see what it looks like. OK, so the call is active. You can see here that I've called the Lua script, and now it's just streaming silence. And so first I'll send the 3 key. You can see it hit that one leg of the if-then logic, but the call is still going. So then if I send a 9, it's going to do something a little different. So now it returned that break. It stopped playing the file. That was the last thing going on in the call, so it hung up. So that's a little taste. And again, there's many methods hanging off a session, but that's a few of them to give you a kind of a taste of what you can do with the leg of a call. Probably the most useful thing for me is what I found in this next example, which is database access. I don't know what y'all are doing with FreeSWITCH, but I don't ever get a call that comes in that I don't look up some information for a customer in a database. So as a reference, just so we know what data we're talking about, I've got a simple table here of name and hair color, and that's what I'm going to be accessing in this example. Now, once again, the FreeSWITCH Lua integration makes it ridiculously easy to do this. So FreeSWITCH object has a DBH method on it, and it natively understands the ODBC connection strategy. So if you can connect to from your server, if you can connect to your database via ODBC, then getting a database connection and working with it is as simple as passing the ODBC connection string and getting back an object and then running methods on it, which is exactly what we're going to do here. Something else to note on line 10 is Lua has asserts. So here, what I'm doing is I'm running the connected method on the DBH object I got back, and that tells me whether I'm connected to the database or not. When you assert, it's basically like when you're running a test suite. If you assert and it returns true, then it'll continue. But if it returns false, it'll throw an error. So if the data, in this case, we wouldn't want to continue if we didn't have a connection to the database. So I just assert are we connected? And if we are, we continue. If not, it throws a script error. On line 12, you can see I'm just pulling all that data from the table I showed you earlier. And then on lines 16 through 21, this is the other main syntax for how you can declare data in a table. It's more of a key value, a record style, hash. So you have something equals something. You get your key and your value separated by commas is that particular structure. It's important to note, though, that this particular structure of storing data in a table does not preserve order. So when you loop this, you're going to get it back in whatever order it gives you, and it's basically random. Coming down to the bottom here on line 29, I'm calling the query method on that DBH object that we created up above, and I'm passing it the SQL string so that we can collect all that data from the table. And I'm passing it a callback. Now, something important to note here is that functions are first-class objects in Lua, so I can pass a function as an argument to another function. So that's what I'm doing here on line 29, and then on 24 through 27, that's the callback, and it's dead simple, right? Like this is pretty much stuff that I think we've covered already. I'm just collecting, or I'm formatting a message of the name and the person's hair color, and then I'm logging it to the console. The callback, so one thing, this felt really tricky to me when I first started working with FreeSWITCH DBH, but basically what happens is when you run that query method on line 29, the callback function gets fired once for every row of data that's returned. So it's just going to keep getting called, and each time that data argument there on line 24 is going to contain another row of data in a table that you can access. You can see that table access method on line 25, data.name, data.haircolor. See that guy in action. So here is where the script was called, and then you can see here's where it's pulling from the database, and I just color-coded it for fun. So that's database access. It's kind of crazy simple. I love it. All right, last example, and it's certainly the most complicated. I'm going to try to cram a bunch in here. This is talking to an outside web service. And I picked another pretty standard example. I'm looking up weather by zip code, which in my business is actually a pretty handy thing to do. So one of the things I want to try to accomplish with this example is to show you guys about the module system in Lua. Both how you would consume, modules are sort of the way that you encapsulate functionality in Lua. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you would consume a third-party module to be able to use for your needs, and how you would create your own module that other people could consume, or you could use it to encapsulate your own functionality that you could consume in various places. So I'm going to skip around a bit because it just makes more sense in describing what I'm trying to accomplish. So on line 11 and 12, you can see that's how I'm consuming third-party modules into my code. Okay, so you call the require with the name of the module, and then it's going to return some object that you can work with. Usually that is a hash-based table that has like methods hanging on it that you can call. That is true with both of these third-party libraries. And these are two of the more popular ones. The LuaSec module allows you to make HTTPS requests, and the socket module allows you to do all kinds of stuff with sockets. So now skipping back up, to rehash or recap, that's how you would consume a module from some outside. So if I'm going to create my own module, which I'm doing in this example, there's sort of a canonical way to do it. And on line 7, I'm declaring an empty table. And then down on line 17, I'm adding a key to that table that is a function, the function getWeatherData. And inside this function, you can see where I'm using the escape method from the socket library just to do some URL escaping. That's on line 19. And then on line 23 is where the big thing happens, which is I'm calling the request method on the HTTPS object that I got back from the LuaSec module. I'm giving it a website to visit, an endpoint, and it's giving me back a whole bunch of data. Something cool to notice here on line 23 is that Lua does allow you to return multiple values from a function, and then, as I'm doing here, consume those multiple values from a function that sends multiple values. I really wish more languages did this. I love it. Let's see. Skipping down. Just to finish out this particular function, I'm just checking the status code and printing a couple different things based upon what I get back. I'm going to get back a JSON string. And then at the bottom here, there's a couple things happening. Let's go to the very bottom first. So on line 42, you'll see that I'm returning that table that I declared earlier that I had put the method in. That's how you're going to allow people to consume a module that you're writing. Is whatever it is you return from that script that you're writing, that's going to be what they'll get back when they call that require statement. So in this case, they have a getWeatherData method in a table. And then here on line 36 and 38 through 38, I just did a little kind of example of how you might make a module that could also do something. It's kind of similar to the Python main thing where you test to see if it's being run as a script or you can consume it as a module. And it also illustrates how you can consume arguments. So on line 36, you'll see that argv is the object where arguments are passed, and it's bracket syntax, and Lua is not 0 indexed, it's indexed from 1. So basically there I'm saying if their first argument exists, then call the getWeatherData function with that argument. And then you could run this, you just run that web service call Lua, pass it a zip code, and you would actually be able to get data back. I think that's about everything in this example. So let's see it run. Yep. Hot dog, my web service is up. So here you can see the Lua script was called. I've got a debug console log thing where I'm printing the exact URL that I went to. And then here's the data back as JSON. Now, that's just a big old JSON string that I'm dumping to console. It's hard to read. And if we get to the tips later, I'll show you guys how you can clean that up a bit. So I think that does it for the examples. Pretty sure I'm doing OK on time. I've kind of moved along at a pretty good clip here. So I'm gonna dig into the tips I have. Hopefully you'll find those useful as well. Oh, before then, let me just give you some highlights about what else you can do. That's a good one. So we touched on some functionality, but it's like probably not even 10% of what you can do. So I'm just going to give you sort of a quick overview of some of the other things you can do to kind of whet your appetite. So you can get and set session variables and global variables from Lua scripts. You can have full access to the FreeSWITCH event system, including firing events and consuming events. You've got all kinds of call management stuff available in the session object, including originating calls, recording files. You can set a hang-up hook so that when a call is hung up, it'll fire something that allows you to do something around maybe you're cleaning up something after a call. And there's a bunch of other methods on the session object. Excuse me. You can make IVR menus programmatically. When I first started, I was using FreeSWITCH, the IVR XML stuff, but and I still do in some places, but you can also do it programmatically. You can send email. FreeSWITCH object has an email method that allows you to send an email with a simple attachment. If you want to do something more complicated, there's third-party libraries you can leverage to be able to do that too. You can serve dial plan config in Lua. I've never tried this at all. I have no idea how it works, but I know you can do it. And I included a link if you want to dig into that particular functionality. And tons more. I still didn't cover it all. Hopefully that does give you an idea of what the range of the capability that exists. It's really what I'm trying to illustrate. So in the last 12 or 13 years of me doing this, I did pick up a few things that helped, convenience-wise. So I'm going to try to share those with you here. First one is it's awful handy when you're debugging to be able to look at whatever object you're trying to get a look at in a way that's formatted nicely. Now, since Lua is so small, it doesn't have any kind of inspection function built into it. You can roll your own, people do, but the inspect.lua project is a really nice implementation, and it's the one I use. It's very convenient. Basically, you require it as a module, then you execute it, you pass it any variable, and it's going to pretty print it for you. It's really nice. I think I even have an example of that here somewhere. Let's see. Yes, here. So super simple to use. You just require inspect. It gives you back an inspect function. And then you can see on line 8, I'm calling the inspect function and passing it the FreeSWITCH object, which is kind of cool because you can now inspect the actual object that is doing all these things to provide the FreeSWITCH integration. And when I run this example, you're going to see there's a whole lot that we haven't covered. Yeah, so that's all just that giant FreeSWITCH object that does all tons of stuff. Looks like it's a bit fuzzy there. Let me see if I can focus on one section. Yeah, so when I mentioned earlier that the session has a lot of methods hanging off of it, that's some of them, just as it's going down. That's not even all of them, but there's tons and tons of methods on that session object. So that's inspect. Allows you to inspect any kind of variable or object in Lua. Really easy. So what I do is I just drop it into my scripts directory, and then I just require inspect and use it that way. It's really easy that way. Parsing JSON. It's not built into Lua, so there is a pretty decent third-party library. However, there's also a JSON parser built into the FreeSWITCH mod Lua, this FreeSWITCH JSON. So you can use that to encode and decode JSON. And I believe I've got an example of that too. Yeah, so there's a couple of different things going on in this last tip. I just kind of wove some things together. So you can see here I'm getting the inspect on line 5. And then I'm getting a JSON parser on line 6 by calling FreeSWITCH JSON. on lines 9 through 14 is an example of how you would encode JSON. So I have in a record style table that I'm creating there, and then I'm calling it to the encode method to turn it from a table into a JSON string. And then the final section there, 17 through 20, I'm doing the reverse. I'm decoding a JSON string. And what you'll notice on line 17 is that's where I'm actually requiring the module that I built in example 5. So you can see require examples dot web source 5. That's me requiring that module. And if we go back there for reference, you'll see that's where I declared it on line 7. And then I added this get weather data function, and then I returned that object. And that's where that's what you're getting back, is this web service object has that get weather data method. And you can call that, and then you'll get a JSON string back. So once I have the JSON string, then I'm going to use the JSON thing I created up on line 6 and actually get it back into a table in Lua, which I will then use to call the inspect to get pretty printed output for, this is for illustration. You do different things with it, but it does give you an idea of all the different kind of weaving all the different things together. So I'm going to pull down that weather data for a specific zip code, and then I'm going to pretty print the results. All right, so here is where the script is called. You can see right there, that's me converting the table into a JSON string. And then I'm visiting the weather map thing, which is basically just, I called the module, right? This is the same function we saw in example 5. But here is where I'm calling inspect on that. Well, I parse the data in the script into a table, right? And then here is where I'm pretty printing that Lua table, so it's just a lot easier to read. And very, very finally, I encourage you to read the documentation. So, I mean, that's kind of obvious, but really there's a lot of good documentation. The Programming in Lua book, also called the PIL book, I believe it's even available for free online. It's excellent. If you want to master Lua, that's where you would start. And then the FreeSWITCH Lua API reference in the wiki is also very good. Got just about everything you can do in there with example code. Now, I appreciate you guys tolerating the fact that I did this entire presentation on the command line. There wasn't a whole lot of visuals. So I'm going to close with my one graphic. Anybody have any questions?
That's incredible, Chad. We do have time for 1 or 2 questions. So if anyone has one, I think we have. Oh.
So not so much about your presentation. I've heard about Lua a lot. I know it's in a lot of different systems, never had time to play with it. What's a good for dummy book for somebody that's completely new to it to start slowly playing with it?
I haven't consumed those. Back in 2010-ish, I'd been working with it for a couple of years. And what I did was I read the PIL book, the Programming in Lua book, and I think it was kind of amusing because I think at that time I was almost sort of seen as a FreeSWITCH Lua expert back then, and I think the only reason was because I read that book. And so I just understood the language in a way. It was almost like they hooked it up to Lua because they knew it was good, but nobody bothered to look at all that Lua could do. And so once I read the book, I had this level of mastery. So what I would recommend is the PIL book. I mean, it's the one I've read. It's excellent. It'll give you soup to nuts. It's not a dummies book, but it's pretty easy to consume.
Thank you, Chad. And it looks like we have one final question real quick.
Technically, I've got 2, and I'll make them real short, and I'll give them both to you, Chad, so that you can answer them how you feel best. I've actually been utilizing Lua in FreeSWITCH for years, and actually did get something out of your presentation, so I really appreciate that. But my questions are, basically, where do you draw the line between utilizing Lua as your dial plan versus utilizing the XML dial plan, and how do you best deal with memory leaks?
I haven't. Well, to answer your second question first, I really haven't had any memory leak problems. That's not true. I had one memory leak problem, but it was with a third-party library. So I swapped it out. The Lua provides a database connectivity library. I think it's called Lua SQL, and the MySQL driver notoriously leaked in FreeSWITCH. It may still to this day, and so I just stopped using it. That was the only memory leak problem I've ever had. I think Lua probably does a pretty good job of just cleaning up after itself, is my guess. And it's wicked fast. I mean, back when I wrote that comedian mail replica, we ran that against Astra's comedian mail, which is written in some kind of version of C, and it was basically keeping up. So, it's good with memory, it's fast, and I haven't had any memory leak issues. To address your first question, which is the harder one, I don't know, it's an art form, I would say the working rule of thumb is I try to use the dial plan XML until I'm fighting with it, until it's at the point I'm fighting with it. That's what I recognize. I'm trying to use it in a way that it's not designed, right? And so that's when I start to look to scripting. And I think the other thing that's useful is don't be shy about weaving back and forth. I do that all the time. Like I'll use the dial plan, then I run into a place where I can't use it. I'll farm it out to a Lua script and then transfer back to the dial plan. So I just weave in and out of wherever I need at the time, and it works quite well.
All right. Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, give a round of applause for Chad.